Now, the BBC has issued an on-air apology this morning for their false reporting on the Israel Defense Forces actions inside Gaza's al-Shifa hospital. The organisation incorrectly stated that Reuters, the news agency, were reporting that the IDF were targeting Arab speakers and medical staff after Israeli troops attacked the medical facility on Tuesday. BBC News responded with this statement today.
And now an apology from the BBC. BBC News, as it covered initial reports that Israeli forces has entered Gaza's main hospital. We said that medical teams and Arab speakers were being targeted. This was incorrect and misquoted a Reuters report. We should have said IDF forces included medical teams and Arabic speakers for this operation. So we apologise for this error, which fell below our usual editorial standards. The correct version of events was broadcast minutes later.
Well, the Jewish Board of Deputies has responded to the BBC report, saying, at best, this shows a staggering lack of care when reporting on a highly volatile situation, which can have a knock-on effect all over the world, including in Britain, where anti-Semitic attacks have risen by more than 500% since October the 7th. Incidents like this make a mockery of the BBC's oft-stated dedication to professionalism and impartiality. The corporation must issue a public apology without delay for this egregious reporting. Well, joining us now is editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallis-Simons. Jake, when I read this story, I was absolutely astonished because when you compare the two things that were said, Reuters saying that, and quoting the IDF, we can confirm incubators, baby food and medical supplies brought by IDF tanks from Israel have successfully reached the Shifa hospital. Our medical teams and Arabic-speaking soldiers are on the ground to ensure that these supplies reach those in need, i.e. Arabic speakers within the IDF are making sure medicine gets to people who need it in hospital. And somehow the BBC turned that into the IDF are targeting Arab speakers in the hospital. This isn't an editorial mistake. This isn't just an accidental tripping over of words, surely.
Well, I mean, from one point of view, it's a bit like those football bloopers when you see a goalkeeper trying to throw the ball out to a defender and mistakenly throwing it into his own net. But at the same time, you must ask the question, if the same goalkeeper keeps making the same mistake and keeps scoring own goals in that way, what's wrong with the goalkeeper? And a lot of viewers, I think, are asking the same question about the BBC, because even though I'm sure, I've worked at the BBC a lot, I'm a big fan of the BBC in general, but even though I don't think that any BBC journalist goes to work in the morning saying, you know what, I'm going to be biased today, let's forget impartiality, throw it out the window, I'm just going to stick it to the Jews. No one goes to work and says that. But whenever a mistake is made, it tends to be a mistake in the same direction. We haven't seen any mistakes, as far as I'm aware, in the opposite direction, mistakenly reporting too kindly on the Israelis or mistakenly criticising Hamas too much or anything like that. It always seems to be in this same direction. I think that's a problem that the BBC is going to struggle to tackle and doesn't really have any ideas about how to deal with it.
Yeah, because, Jake, this follows, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it, when that missile landed actually in a hospital car park and turned out to have been a terrorist missile, nothing to do with the Israelis, and yet the BBC, a guy called John Donison on the scene, said it's something along the lines of, it's difficult to see who could be responsible for this attack other than the IDF, than the Israelis. Turned out to be absolutely not the IDF or the Israelis, who are both the same things, of course. And now we have this situation. Now, what I think, if we were being extremely generous, I'll take your point that all their mistakes seem to be in the same direction. But if we're being extremely generous, say that, journalists do sometimes make honest mistakes. I suspect this isn't all that honest, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Here's another scandal, though, to this apology that they were forced to make. What did they do? They did it very, very quietly while the Rwanda verdict was being announced by the Supreme Court. In other words, they tried to slip it under the wire. They tried to make this a good day to bury bad news for the BBC. Not really being transparent with licence fee payers, wouldn't you say?
You could see it like that, I suppose. But I think from the BBC's point of view, if they had delayed it further, then they'd be under more criticism for delaying it. I mean, there was a big level of outrage towards this egregious misreporting with good reason. And I think the BBC was under a lot of pressure to respond quickly and not to string this out. And so I think in a way they're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of position. But let's look at the other example you mentioned of the hospital. I think we must recognise that pretty much all media outlets around the world made the same mistake as the BBC, or many of them did. The New York Times had to apologise as well, and other papers and outlets also apologised. But the BBC, for a start, has a greater burden of responsibility because it is charged explicitly with impartiality, and it's funded by the licence fee payer. But also I would point out that, as the Jewish Chronicle has revealed, John Donnison, that reporter that you mentioned who went freelance and speculated that it must be the Israelis in this case, he has form. He had previously been criticised and actually penalised by the BBC for tweeting a picture of an atrocity in Syria and saying that it was an example of Israeli brutality in Gaza. So this guy had form. So all I'm saying is that the BBC has a history of many mistakes of this sort. And it does seem to form a bit of a pattern that does need to be addressed. But how they can address it under the surface, it's a cultural thing, I think is very, very difficult for them.
I think you're being rather generous towards the BBC, if I may say so myself. And certainly I'd like to assume that UK journalists might make mistakes, but do work for the BBC, wanting to uphold impartiality, even if sometimes culturally they struggle with it. But let's not forget, the BBC is an internationally extremely influential organisation via the World Service, has lots of different outputs in different languages all around the world, uses various stringers and has employees in BBC offices in almost every country on the planet. Do you not think, actually, when things have quietened down a bit, there needs to be some sort of audit as to quite who they might have employed, particularly when there is such a burden of international responsibility?
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, I think that in particular, BBC Arabic is a real problem. At the Jewish Chronicle, we've reported a lot on the repeated departures from impartiality at BBC Arabic in the Arabic language, which is broadcast to millions and millions of viewers across the Middle East and has a very, very powerful influence, repeatedly calling all Israeli settlers and all Israeli town settlements, repeating Hamas talking points. We had an example of a terrorist folk song being celebrated and sung in the studio, and the allegation that Israel had no culture of its own, only what it had stolen from other cultures, things like that. And indeed, there's been about more, I think 100 or 200 upheld complaints over the past couple of years about BBC Arabic. So that's complaints that have been found by the BBC to be valid and upheld and worthy of correction. And yet they keep on happening. So BBC Arabic is a particular pocket of Israelophobia, if you like. It's particularly problematic. And that does really need to be addressed. But as for the English language output, again, the same mistakes happen again and again. There is a cultural problem, I believe, at the BBC, where they focus very much on diversity of race, diversity perhaps of class and disabilities and so on, but very little on diversity of political view. And I think that leads to a kind of groupthink, which overall can tend to bleed out in its coverage, even though it's trying to be impartial.
Some years ago, Jake, the BBC commissioned an investigation into the possibility that it was inherently anti-Semitic, that there was groupthink against Jews there. They carried out this investigation and guess what? They never published it. What do we deduce from that?
Well, there has been some outrage about that consistently coming and going over the past few years. I don't know what that contains, and there are mixed views from inside the corporation as to whether it is damning or not. But the Jewish Chronicle last year ran a campaign calling for an inquiry into BBC reporting on Jews in Israel. That was in the wake of, if you recall, the incident over Hanukkah, where some Jewish kids were taunted and abused in the street. And the BBC mistakenly reported that the Jewish kids had provoked them by uttering some racial slur, which they had not. And so in the wake of that and the other reporting we've been doing into BBC Arabic and other things, we called for an inquiry. We had a petition that attracted 10,000 signatures. And in the end, some peers in the House of Lords and others accepted that and said they were going to take it on. I'm not sure what's happened with that, but we hope that that will happen sometime over the next year or so. But something does need to happen, because the BBC does need, I think, to have a long, hard look at what's going on and what can be done to correct it. BBC Arabic needs some serious attention, but then more broadly across the corporation, we need to find a way to widen the perspective of BBC journalists, so that that blind spot towards Jews in Israel no longer exists and that impartiality is upheld.
Thank you so much, Jake Wallis-Simons. Always a pleasure.